Namaskar. My name is Gaurav Rastogi. I'm a resident faculty at the Hindu Community Institute, and this talk is about Hindu practices of death and grieving. I'm going to begin with this verse from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. As a caterpillar, having come to the end of one blade of grass, draws itself together and reaches out to the next, and so the self, having come to the end of one life, and dispelled all ignorance, gathers in his faculties and reaches out from the old body to the new. Just as easily as a caterpillar reaches out from one blade of grass and curls itself and moves over to the other, gathering itself and moving on. Just like that, in the Hindu tradition, at death, the self moves on, having discarded one body into another. And so the message we have when someone dies is not rest in peace. The message we have when someone dies is Om Shanti Sadgati Praptirastu. Om, of course, you heard me chant. Shanti is peace. Sadgati Praptirastu, the equivalent of may you travel in safety and farewell. In the Hindu tradition, the Atman, the self, does not linger around the body for too long, just a few days, and then, when wished farewell, departs that body and goes on to the next life. And so the concept of rest in peace does not make sense in the Hindu tradition. Instead, wishing farewell is a better way of recognizing the death of a loved one. Hindu practices for death and grieving are very involved, very beautifully stitched together, and extend to several days. I'll get to that. It's a little later in the talk. Let's first talk about the Hindu idea of reincarnation. The fact that we do not believe in an everlasting heaven or hell is a source of great relief and great clarity to those that are about to die and those in whose families there has been a death recently. We are not driven by this fear or greed of infinite heaven or infinite hell, but instead we know that we believe in this evolutionary process from one incarnation to another, and we wish that the next time this person takes birth, they take birth in more favorable circumstances, so they go onward in their journey a little bit more than they did this life, and so on. This means that death is not permanent. Life continues from one body to another. And that means the moral code with which the Hindus understand and live our lives is different from a moral code which implies an infinite heaven and infinite hell. We are not driven by fear, but instead are driven by a process of evolution and recognizing the true meaning of life itself. And that changes the way dying practices also exist in the Hindu tradition. We've had to change things a little, and practices, of course, continue to evolve always. As Hindus have moved into the diaspora, practices have continued to evolve, and I'll talk a little about that as well. Now, in the Hindu tradition, it is understood that because of this process of evolution, the self separates from the body at the moment of death. And then for a few minutes, hours, days, for a certain amount of time lingers around the body and lingers around the family. And eventually, having recognized and understood that the connection to this body and this life is severed, moves on to the next life. And the moment of death and this experience of post death and before birth is an important time in the Hindu tradition, because a confused spirit, a confused soul, or confused self makes confused choices. And instead, we want them to make choices in peace. And which is the reason when we say Om Shanti, we are essentially saying, may you find peace, because a peaceful state allows you to choose a better birth, a further progress in the evolutionary journey, and not a devolution to a lower being or more confused life or worse choices. So the death practices in the Hindu tradition are designed around that. Now, it is understood that maybe a thousand years ago, thousands of years ago, Hindus might have both cremated or buried their dead. But now, for the most part, Hindus cremate our dead. Cremation is an important part of the process of dying and grieving. And in the Hindu tradition, the body is not kept for too long. Maybe a day, maybe 2 days, but generally Hindus do not like to keep the body for too long, for the reason I already described, because we would like to bid them farewell. We'd like them to dissociate from this body. This chapter of evolution is over. So the sooner we dispose of the body, the sooner the self knows to move on to another body. That there is no possibility of returning Lazarus-like into this body and animating it again. That possibility is over. This body is no longer available. You may please proceed on your journey on to the next body. And so Hindus tend to cremate, except little babies and saints. In both cases, there are no cremations, but other than that, there is cremation. And I read the notes that you were offered to read. This is the Bregman note, as well as the videos that you've been asked to watch. The note is broadly accurate. There is not much inaccuracy in that, but the video I have a few comments about, which I will come to. So the practices of grieving don't stop at the cremation. So in the Hindu tradition, we don't generally like to put the body on display, and I'll come to that when I talk about the video. We would like to, as soon as possible, go to the cremation ground and cremate, and then the process of grieving continues for a total 13 days at the time of death, and for many years thereon. And I'll talk about each one of them. The process of grieving, for example, in my case, when my father expired, generally it is the it is the older son who is to do the last rites, which is to put the flame on the funeral pyre. And it is considered a duty of the elder son to do this. And the absence of the elder son weighs heavily on the son himself, as well as, of course, the rest of the family. They generally prefer. Now, I'm the younger son, and I did the last rites for my father, and it caused much grief to my brother. He was not there at the time. It took him a few days to return from America to India when this happened. But we still had to go back the next day. So we did the cremation. We have to go back the next day to collect the remainder of the body, because some part of the skeletal is not does not turn into ashes. So we go in. We have to go collect the ashes, or they're called flowers. You have to collect the flowers, phool, they say in Hindi. You have to collect those, and then you have to take those ashes and, of course, disperse them. We went to the Ganga river, Ganges, to disperse the ashes in the Ganges. This happened. So we collected the ashes the next day, and then a week later we went to the Ganga. The ashes do not come home. The ashes stay at a what's called a nursery, but essentially where all the ashes sit. And then 1 week later, we went to the Ganga and dispersed, and yet continued. The process of grieving continued. The process of grieving goes on typically till day 13. It is designed for the families to grieve fully and completely. No option to not grieve is available. You have to grieve because that is an essential part of recovering from death. And so the entire family comes together. Of course, at the time of cremation, there are people to lift and take her across. But also there's a priest who's doing the last rites. The family themselves do not cook for these 13 days. There are no kitchen fires in that home. So food has to be outsourced, or neighbors or other relatives have to bring food in. Uh, and then at the home, there are typically readings of scripture. So they're sung. So continuous singing is happening. Kirtans are going on, if you know what kirtans are. So kirtans go on at home, and those kirtans bring tremendous relief. Tremendous relief. There are also gatherings where people come and talk about the departed person and really exchange thoughts about the impact that person had on their life. And this allows everyone to participate in the grief, not silently but vocally. And this allows everyone to understand the life that went by. Death in the family is also a time of great and tremendous spiritual transformation. And the Hindu practices are designed around that. The true meaning of life is available only when you are faced face to face with death itself. There, lying before you, is the person you knew and loved so dearly, and yet they lie restless. They lie without moving, rather. So they're lying there, their entire body is lying in rest, and they're not breathing. And something separates their lived person from this dead body that is lying in front of you. That moment and the conversations that follow, that absence of a living person, it is a time of great spiritual transformation. It has been for me, and it has been for countless others that go through this experience every day, that have to go through this. All of us have to go through this experience sometime in life. And when face to face with life, with death, we come to realize the true meaning of life. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to see from these eyes and to know that I am living? These questions are only addressed very directly at this interaction with death. And the Hindu tradition, when the readings are happening, the scriptural reading is happening, typically in North India, where I am from, someone will come in, a priest will come in and read from the Hindu book of death and dying, which is Garud Puran, which is one of the Puranas. So similar to how there is a Tibetan book for dead and dying, there is the Hindu book is Garud Puran, which describes what happens to the self after death and the process of transferring onto a new life. And that describes it in great detail. And that allows people to understand that life continues after death, just in another form. And when you apply that reflexively on yourself, then you understand a little bit more the meaning of life. What does it mean to live? What are the aims and objectives of life? Why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? What of all this money and wealth and fame that I have acquired or that I wish to acquire? Where does it all lead me? And these questions can lead to tremendous spiritual transformation. And in the Hindu tradition, the grieving practices are designed to help people grieve, bring tremendous relief to the family, and pose this question that we must all answer for ourselves. Now, I'd like to tell you step by step the process that happens, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the video as well. Now, in the Hindu tradition, especially now that we're here in the West, we recognize that our traditions were very robust in the mother country, wherever we come from. But as we move into a diaspora, the, the tradition does not transfer as easily, and um, we're having to improvise. For example, when there is a death in the family, people expect naturally to call the local temple and have someone be available to talk. But it turns out the local temples and the priests at the temple are not designed, are not equipped to do this. Their job is not to help with funerals and cremation. Their job is to at the temple to serve the Lord at the temple, and so the temples are ill-equipped to handle cases of death. And that's something that we're having to improvise, and the Hindu Community Institute is working to create a process for handling incoming calls and really describing and hand holding people through this process of death. Then, cleanliness is very important. At death, we make it a we make sure that the body is cleaned before we take them to cremation. Why? Because we are essentially returning the body into from which it comes, and it is important. Like when someone gives you, food in a container, when you return the container back, you clean it and you fill new food into it and return it back. That's how you do it in the Indian tradition. So you don't just consign the body to flame. You have to cleanliness, bathe the body and prepare it completely in order to go to cremation. Then then we talked about the cremation. I talked to you about my own experience. At the cremation, it is true that only men go to the cremation ground. And I'll tell you one more thing, that the cremation grounds typically are known as ghat. A ghat is a riverside, is the side of a river, because that's where we are essentially consigning them and they are moving on to another life. So it is typically called a ghat, even if you're living away from the river and the actual cremation ground is not next to a river. It's still called a ghat because, again, you're transferring from one stage to another. Now, at the cremation, men go to the cremation, the women do not go. And that has been the case in the Hindu tradition. There are exceptions. The Hindu tradition is fluid and does learn. And so as social justice norms change, and I remember reading a note that has been suggested to you to read, those processes do change over time, and exceptions are allowed. And I'll talk about that in another case as well. Then I talked about the ashes being stored, and then the ashes need to be dispersed into typically the river or the ocean, some sort of water body. We do ask in the Hindu tradition. We also ask that you do a memorial, and there is also a formal transfer of the family responsibilities to the eldest male heir, typically, and so that happens as well. Every day for the next 13 days, bhajan and kirtan, which is devotional chanting, happens, and this is a tremendous source of relief and support to the family, because that chanting allows us to heal. It allows us to connect to all the relatives and loved ones that are around, and it allows us to once again praise God and remember our own inner nature as essentially only inhabiting this body. Just as I wear clothes and discard clothes, I inhabit this body, but I am not this body. Just remembering that through this communal chanting, devotional chanting, it's a very healing process. This goes on for 13 days, and then everyone returns to their home. But we're not done yet. The process continues every year, and interestingly, my suspicion is that that Halloween practices are timed somehow, I guess, in Ireland. Or those practices go back to a common time, because around the same time in September or October, for us, this happened about a couple of weeks ago, at the end of September in 2021. And at this time, this is the Shraddh period every year. Shraddh is when we actually once again remember our ancestors and perform rites. We go to a temple or we go to a designated holy place and and perform last rites and offer water and food to our ancestors and wish them well wherever they are in their next life and so on. Um, Another thing that families do, many families, this is North Indian, I don't know if this is also South Indian, but in the North Indian tradition, you would also go to a holy river, like the Ganga River, for example, and there are several spots. So there is Haridwar, there is Gaya, and there's Badrinath Ji, where you would go and you would perform last rites much later. And so you perform sort of a particular ritual, and you have to do that depending on, um, and this ensures sort of an ascension of the in the afterlife for the departed. And so this is a very common thing. We went to, like I said, we went to Haridwar. We also went to Badrinath Ji, which is up in the Himalayas, which is where you would do another set of last rites much later. And so you're supposed to do this for your ancestors. This is all important. It allows us to establish continuity with our ancestors and hope that future generations will continue to participate in this memory and this continuity of being that goes from parent to child and so on and so forth. What else do we have? Okay, so I think we have covered the last rites in general, and in terms of healing and the spiritual transformation, also I have talked at length. Now let me talk to you a little about the note that was sent, and then I have several videos, and I'm going to send you links to those videos. I'll post them somewhere on this video, hopefully, or I'll post them in the links or send you an email with them. There are videos on speaking at a memorial that cite verses from the Bhagavad Gita. So you have scriptural reference. There are more than 20 shlokas that are mentioned, and you're free to watch that video and take notes from that as well. I have another talk on Hindu beliefs of what happens beyond death, and that is also an interesting talk, and I encourage you to also watch that video. Now let me tell you a little bit about the video that you were asked to watch as well. It was a very difficult video to watch for several reasons. One, Hindus in general avoid seeing a dead body. It's considered inauspicious in our tradition. So a video of a funeral pyre or somebody who's dead is considered highly inauspicious to watch, and having to watch this 3 to 5 minute video was very disconcerting and very discomforting. We do not put a show. In fact, even at my father's funeral, photos were taken, and we were instructed by our elders to discard all those photos. We are not to keep those photos and videos. Of course, these are modern times, and people make videos all the time. So, but the tradition is that one does not look at a dead body. It's considered inauspicious. So it was uncomfortable to watch that video. But also, what I found was the usual sort of Western trope of monkeys and flowers and cutting. You show a dead body, someone's grieving, and then you cut to a monkey drinking water from a river. All of this is exotifying and making an Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom type vibe of making people's sacred practices appear trivial and frankly ghoulish. And that is not so at all. If you've watched in a Hindu wedding, you know that we pay attention to weddings. We pay as much, if not more, attention to death. And these are sacred rituals. This Western gaze of monkeys and and dirty water and crying people and some sort of a caste aspersions, that's just ridiculous and frankly insulting. I wish we didn't have to see all of that. I wish you didn't have to see all of that. The Hindu practices in general are actually very sacred, very beautiful, and designed far more scientifically than any other process. We do not hold the body for 2 weeks on end for and put on display for everyone to come by. We don't do any of that stuff because that's not what we want. We do not wish rest in peace that a separated body and a spirit will come join together at Judgment Day. We don't believe in any of that stuff. So we don't insult other people's traditions, but we find it insulting that other people come in and have this sort of exotic and very objectifying gaze, and again making a whole Indiana Jones vibe of it. Again, so don't look at that video and think this is what the tradition is. There are much better videos to watch if you'd like to learn more about Hindu death and grieving practices. But you get a sense of what's going on. It was by the riverside. There are funeral pyres. Bodies are consigned to the flames. And later, the ashes are also dispersed into the river itself because, again, we join back into the ocean. Like all rivers go to the ocean, the spirit too returns back from the source of all of our being, which is, of course, God Himself. So those are important practices, and the Hindu tradition in general has a lot of steps and stages to go through as a part of grieving. Okay, what else did we cover? Do Hindus donate is another question. Again, the body is essentially to be consigned to the flames. I have not heard any objections to donations of body parts. Again, because this body has been discarded, there is no expectation of a full whole body being reunited with this with the spirit. That's not our expectation. So we don't really have any injunctions against reusing body parts like donating the eye or the liver or the heart or the kidney. So in general, Hindus should have no objections to those. I have not come across any major scholarly or otherwise work that states so. Let me see what else I need to cover. When it comes to spiritual transformation, and as people that are working with families that are facing death, you have to recognize that because of our belief in the continuity of life after death into another body and so on, we are less afraid. And so long as one is reminded of what's already said in the scripture, that the self is not burnt by fire or dried by air or wetted by water. The self is not something that's made of the five elements. It's something completely outside of the five elements. Once we are reminded of that, the weight on the heart reduces a little. We still need to grieve for the loss of a loved one, but we are no longer fearful of a forever afterlife, which is, burning in hell or going to heaven and doing whatever. So in that sense, when you meet a family that is dealing with death, a reminder that the self is not made of the five elements. It's outside of the five elements, and therefore you may grieve for the relationship, but the person continues to live and move on to another life. That's an important reminder. And encouraging people to reach out within the community. Now, of course, we're in the diaspora, so not many people know. And city to city, community to community, practices differ in detail. And they can reach out to the Hindu Community Institute. Our counselors are available. We do have a whole process diagram and a stage-wise process available on our website that I encourage you to look at and also share with the families that are dealing with this. And with that, I think we are done with this. I believe there are some of my colleagues in your class, and I encourage you to engage them in a discussion on Hindu death rites as well as grieving practices. With that, I'm going to chant Om once, and then I wish you all the best. Thank you for listening. Oh.